The studio lights were set with surgical precision, each camera positioned to capture every detail, every expression, every flash of emotion. The atmosphere was charged with tension, a kind of invisible electricity that kept everyone on the edge of their seats. That night, millions of viewers gathered in front of their screens waiting for something extraordinary, a confrontation that could change the course of modern political discourse. At the center of it all was Victoria Steele, the renowned journalist, whose name had become synonymous with relentless and incisive interviews. Her penetrating gaze and her ability to deconstruct even the most well-prepared interviewees had made her one of the most feared figures in journalism. Seasoned politicians had already fallen under her scrutiny, unable to escape her meticulous approach. But tonight, her opponent was not an ordinary politician. Sitting before her, with impeccable posture and an almost superhuman calm, was Barron Trump, the young man whose surname carried unparalleled weight. Until that moment, he had remained an enigmatic figure, avoiding the direct limelight of politics, despite always being a name whispered in the corridors of power. But tonight, he had finally stepped forward, and all of America was watching. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, every movement calculated, every glance measured. As Victoria Steele arranged her papers with deliberate slowness, a small smile crossed her lips. She was ready to deconstruct him, to expose him, to corner him until he had nowhere to go. The opening vignette of the program faded away, replaced by a charged silence. The audience held its breath. "Barron," Victoria began, her voice controlled yet sharp, "this is the interview that many people have been waiting for." Barron tilted his head ever so slightly in an almost imperceptible gesture. "So let's give them what they want," he replied, his voice calm with not a trace of nervousness. Victoria raised an eyebrow. He wasn't backing down, and that only made things more interesting. "You grew up under the public's gaze, but you rarely chose to speak directly. Is that going to change tonight?" There was a subtle invitation in the question, a disguised challenge. Barron kept his gaze fixed on her, his expression unaltered. "Silence does not mean absence," he said, pausing for a moment. "Sometimes it means preparation." A murmur rippled through the audience. The response wasn't defensive, nor was it hesitant. It was strategic. He had effortlessly sidestepped the trap. Victoria shifted her approach. If he wouldn't be shaken by subtleties, she would up the pressure. "Your name is one of the most polarizing in recent history," she continued, crossing her legs with absolute confidence. "It carries power, expectation, and controversy. Like it or not, it shapes how people see you. My question is, has it also shaped how you see yourself?" It was a loaded question. If he admitted that his name defined him, he would seem like a mere heir to a family legacy. Denying it might make him appear disconnected from reality. Barron exhaled slowly, remaining in control. "We are all shaped by the context in which we grow up," he said. "But the difference between being molded and being defined is a matter of choice." Victoria narrowed her eyes. He wasn't just answering, he was redirecting. "You speak of choice," she insisted, "but how much choice did you really have? You were born into a world of influence. You didn't have to fight for a place at the table. You inherited that place. Is that privilege, or do you reject that label?" The question was a calculated trap. Admitting privilege could alienate those who despise the political elite. Denying it might make him seem oblivious to criticism. Barron, however, did not take the bait. Instead, he allowed a slight, almost imperceptible smile to cross his lips. "Privilege is an interesting word," he said thoughtfully. "If a doctor's son grows up with access to the best education, is he privileged? If a musician's son grows up surrounded by music, is that privilege? Or is privilege just another way of saying that some people start their journey differently?" Victoria's fingers subtly tightened on the table. He wasn't just answering, he was reframing the conversation. "So you acknowledge it," she said, leaning in slightly. "I acknowledge that no one chooses where they begin," Barron replied. "Only where they go from there." A heavy silence settled over the studio. Some in the audience nodded, while others exchanged surprised glances. Victoria sensed what was happening. He wasn't evading, he was taking the lead. If she allowed him to continue controlling the narrative, she would end up on the defensive. Let's talk about something that can't be defined by privilege, she said, shifting tactics. The public gaze. Unlike the rest of your family, you managed to stay out of the direct scrutiny of the media for years. But now, you're here. Tell me, Barron, why now? Barron let the silence stretch for a few seconds before answering. Because silence is not always the best response, he said. Sometimes people don't just need to hear stories, they need to hear from the right voices. Victoria narrowed her eyes. It was a subtle yet pointed observation. He was suggesting that his presence was more than just an interview. It was a statement. So you believe you are that voice? She pressed. I believe people deserve to decide that for themselves, he replied. The tension in the room pulsed like a live wire. This exchange was not just about politics or privilege, it was about control. Victoria leaned back, crossing her arms. All right, she said, adopting a more casual tone. Let's take your name out of the equation. Imagine you weren't a Trump. No legacy, no recognition. Do you think people would still be listening to you right now? Barron exhaled softly, a subtle glimmer in his eyes. People listen to me because of my name, he admitted. But if I had nothing of value to say, would they still be listening right now? The studio erupted. Murmurs, applause, surprised looks. He hadn't just neutralized the attack, he had turned it into a point in his favor. Victoria pressed her lips together, hiding any sign of frustration. She had spent her career controlling interviews, dictating the pace, mastering the narrative. But Barron Trump was proving to be different. She knew she had to act quickly. All right, she said, her voice intensifying. Let's get to the point. You've spent this entire interview defining yourself, challenging perceptions. But let's cut to the chase. Are you entering politics? Barron hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But Victoria noticed. Then he smiled. I'm not going to enter politics just because my surname is Trump, he said, but I'm not going to avoid it just because some people think I shouldn't. The studio plunged into a deep silence. It wasn't a confirmation nor a denial. It was something more deliberate. Victoria realized what he had just done. He hadn't answered the question. He had transformed it into a narrative. And for the first time that night, she knew she was dealing with someone who wasn't just answering questions. He was playing the long game. The studio seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the moment. The cameras captured every detail, every subtle change in the body language of both Victoria and Barron. The interview, which had begun as a planned interrogation to expose him, was now transforming into something much larger. Victoria knew she had to change her strategy once again. She took a deep breath and adopted a more controlled tone, though her mind was still racing, searching for a gap. A moment of hesitation she could exploit. You're leaving a lot of questions unanswered tonight, Barron, she said, interlacing her fingers on the table. But let's be direct. If one day America asked you to lead, would you say yes? The ensuing silence was unlike any other. It wasn't just a pause, it was pure anticipation, the weight of the question hanging over the studio. Barron did not rush to answer. He allowed the question to settle, letting the audience feel its significance. Then, finally, he exhaled and leaned in slightly. The real question, he said, his voice firm yet unhurried, is not whether I would say yes. The real question is whether America is ready for a different kind of leader. The impact of his answer reverberated through the studio like a wave. Some viewers murmured among themselves, others nodded, recognizing the significance behind his words. He had avoided a direct answer, yet by doing so, he had sparked a new debate. Victoria narrowed her eyes. He was reshaping the entire interview, molding the narrative to his liking. So you're saying you'd consider it, she pressed, not wanting to let the moment slip. Barron offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. I'm saying that leadership isn't just about wanting the position, he replied. It's about being ready for it. Once again, he had sidestepped the trap and at the same time introduced a new angle to the conversation. Victoria inhaled slowly. She needed to change course. Let's talk about responsibility, she said. Regardless of the path you choose, your name carries a history. Some people admire it, others criticize it. Have you ever felt that the expectations placed upon you are a burden? The question was surgical, designed to cut through his composure and force him to reveal something beyond calculated answers. Barron maintained his gaze on her for a moment before responding. "The burden is not the problem," he said. "The challenge lies in how you choose to carry it." The audience reacted once more. Murmurs spread throughout the studio. Some nodded in approval, while others exchanged unreadable looks. Victoria realized that not only was he handling the questions well, but he was turning each one into an opportunity to reaffirm his presence. She knew she had to be more incisive. "You've spent this interview talking about defining yourself, about not letting your name shape your future," she said. "But whether you like it or not, people will always first see you as your father's son. Do you think you can really escape that shadow?" Barron observed her for a moment, as if weighing the question, considering every word before giving his answer. "I don't need to escape a shadow," he said. "I just need to stand in my own light." This time, the reaction was instantaneous. The audience burst into applause. Some viewers stood up, impressed by his answer. Others fell silent, trying to process what they had just heard. Victoria pressed her lips together. This time she did not try to hide her surprise. She had spent years deconstructing public figures, dismantling their personas, exposing their vulnerabilities. But that night, she was facing someone who didn't need to hide behind a facade. He knew exactly who he was, and showed no intention of deviating from it. Yet, there was one last card to play. She waited for the buzz of the audience to subside before continuing, her voice lower, more penetrating. "Since we're talking about who you really are," she said, her expression serious, "let's address the question everyone wants to know." The energy in the room shifted once again. Barron's expression became slightly more alert. He knew that the next question would be crucial. Victoria did not hesitate. "Your father was one of the most controversial figures in recent history," she stated. "Some revere him, others believe he was one of the most divisive leaders of our time." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "Tell me, Barron, have you ever felt ashamed of something he said or did?" The air in the studio grew heavy. The audience shifted in their seats. Everyone knew the impact of that question. If he said yes, it would be seen as a betrayal of his father's legacy. If he said no, he might appear blind to criticism. For the first time that night, the studio was suffused with silence. But Barron Trump did not hesitate. He maintained his posture and simply replied, "Have you ever been ashamed of something President Biden said or did?" The impact was immediate. The studio exploded with reactions. Some people sighed, others laughed, and some were completely silent. Victoria blinked in surprise. She had prepared for countless responses, but not for this. Quickly, she composed herself. "This isn't about me, Barron," she retorted. But Barron did not back down. "You're a journalist," he said, his gaze firm. "Your job is to challenge assumptions and make the public think. So tell me, why is it fair to ask if I'm ashamed of my father, but not fair to ask the same about the current president?" The studio erupted once more. Some people applauded, while others exchanged astonished looks. Victoria took a deep breath. She knew she needed to regain control of the interview. "All right," she said, adjusting her approach. "Let's bring this back to you." The audience quieted, and Barron remained composed. "You've spent this interview proving that you can handle the pressure," Victoria continued. "But let's cut all that for a moment. At the end of the day, do you really know who you are? Are you just a product of the media's perception?" A direct question, designed to unsettle him. But Barron answered without hesitation. "If I were just a name," he said, his voice calm, "why would I be sitting here answering these questions myself?" The audience erupted once again. Even Victoria felt the weight of what had just transpired. She had set the stage for an interrogation, yet in the end, Barron Trump turned it into a declaration. And for the first time that night, she realized that she was not the one in control. He was. The studio was no longer just a stage. It was a battlefield, and the dust was settling. But one thing was clear to everyone watching, whether in the studio or at home. Barron Trump had not only survived this interview, he had dominated it. Victoria Steele observed the young man before her. His posture remained composed, his expression unreadable. But something in his gaze had changed. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't anger. It was respect. She had spent the night trying to test him, but in the end he was not just his father's son. He was his own person. And America was listening. The studio was silent, yet the energy still pulsed in the air. Victoria Steele took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She knew that this interview would mark a historic moment. "Well, Barron," she said, offering a small smile, "I think we can all agree on one thing tonight." She paused, looking at the audience, and then at him. "You're not just another surname." Barron nodded without a word. The interview ended, but its impact would last far beyond the closing credits. And now we want to hear your opinion. Leave your comment and subscribe to the channel for more content like this.